For 22 years, I knew nothing beyond the chipped walls and groaning floors of St. Jude's orphanage. Then, a convoy of matte black SUVs tore through the quiet of our gravel drive. They hadn't come to adopt anyone. They'd come to tear my life apart, because a grandfather I never knew had left me everything he owned. The smell of St. Jude's in Portland, Maine, is something that never leaves you. Industrial bleach, overboiled oats, and the silent, suffocating hope of 50 kids praying today is their day. I'd aged out of the system 4 years before, but I stayed. 22 years old, working as assistant director under the iron-willed Mrs. Agatha Higgins, a woman built from discipline but lined with tenderness. She'd practically raised me. I was content. My history was a blank page, but my days had meaning. That meaning cracked open on a grey Tuesday morning in November. I was kneeling in the front courtyard, fighting a corroded bike chain back onto its gears for a 7-year-old named Tommy. Then gravel popped beneath heavy tires. 3 matte black Cadillac Escalades rolled in like a funeral escort for someone important, grotesquely wrong against our crumbling brick walls. The doors swung open in unison. The people who stepped out were not prospective parents. They were something else entirely, something hungry. At the front walked a woman in her late 50s. She wore a spotless white cashmere coat that seemed to glow against the drizzle. Her face was pulled tight, part bloodline, part surgeon's precision, and hidden behind dark sunglasses that swept across the orphanage with open contempt. Flanking her was a man in a wrinkled charcoal suit, sweating through the cold, his fingers twitching around a freshly lit cigarette. Behind them both came an older gentleman, leather briefcase thick as a dictionary, expression blank, professional, hard. __quote, _0, __. I asked, dragging bike grease off my palms onto my denim overalls as I stood. The woman tilted her sunglasses down. Sharp blue eyes catalogued my tangled auburn hair, my stained clothes. Quote, 1. Something knotted tight behind my ribs. Quote, 2. Her jaw locked so hard I thought the bones might splinter. She shot a glance at the sweating man beside her. He just shook his head slowly. Quote, 3, he muttered. Quote, 4. They walked past me without another word, straight up the worn wooden steps. I told Tommy to get inside. Then followed the strange trio into Mrs. Higgins' cramped, overstuffed office. Mrs. Higgins was already on her feet behind the desk, brow creased deep. "Who are you, and why have you walked into my facility without announcement?" The man with the briefcase moved forward. He placed a thick, embossed card on the desk. "My name is Harrison Sterling, senior partner at Sterling & Sterling Law in Boston. I represent the estate of the late Arthur Pendleton. These are his surviving children, Beatrice Pendleton and Richard Pendleton." Arthur Pendleton. The name was hollow to me, but Mrs. Higgins drew a sharp breath. Her hand pressed flat against her chest. Her gaze swung between me and the lawyer. "Mr. Pendleton passed away 3 days ago," Harrison Sterling continued, his tone even. "We are here regarding Lily." "Me?" I stepped closer. Confusion was dissolving into something darker, something cold. "I don't know anyone named Pendleton." Beatrice let out a sharp, dismissive breath. Arms folded across that pristine coat. "Of course you don't. You were a loose end, deliberately kept ignorant. Your mother was Sarah Pendleton, my late sister. She ran off, disgraced the family name, and died giving birth to you in a charity ward. My father, driven by some warped sense of obligation, refused to acknowledge your existence until his mind began to fail." Richard chimed in, bitter and clipped, flicking an invisible speck from his sleeve. I couldn't move. 22 years I'd carried a blank space where parents should have been. Now, in the span of a few sentences, I had a mother named Sarah, a grandfather, an aunt and uncle standing 3 feet from me, radiating pure hostility. "We are not here for some family reunion," Beatrice said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She pulled a thick document from her designer handbag and dropped it onto Mrs. Higgins' desk with deliberate force. A polished silver fountain pen followed. Quote 13. Her eyes locked onto mine. Quote 14. $50,000. For an orphan pulling minimum wage, that was life-changing money. But the air in that room had gone dense, heavy with everything no one was saying. I studied the document, then the pen, then Beatrice's eyes, hungry, frantic beneath the composure. "Why?" I asked quietly. "I beg your pardon?" Beatrice snapped. "Why drive all the way from Boston in 3 SUVs with a corporate lawyer to hand an orphan $50,000 for one signature?" I stepped closer to the desk. My pulse was slamming against my ribs. If my grandfather had dementia, if the will is invalid, then my signature means nothing. You need it because the will holds. Whatever he left me is worth far more than $50,000. Richard's face twisted. Underscore underscore quote underscore 19 underscore 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 quote underscore 20 underscore underscore. Harrison Sterling's voice sliced through the room like a whip. The lawyer stepped between me and my uncle. He faced me, and something in his expression shifted. Barely, but enough to notice. "Miss Harper, as executor of Arthur Pendleton's estate, I am legally obligated to inform you of the will's contents before you sign any renunciation. I strongly counseled Miss Pendleton against this ambush." "Harrison, you work for us," Beatrice shrieked. "I work for Arthur," Harrison corrected, his tone cold as steel. "And Arthur is deceased." He turned back to me, unclasped his leather briefcase, and withdrew a blue-backed legal document. "Lily Harper, your grandfather did not leave you some token amount. He spent his final 2 years actively searching for you. He found you. He watched you from a distance. He saw the work you do here. And in his last will and testament, he completely disinherited Beatrice and Richard." The room went silent. Nothing but the ticking of a cheap wall clock. "Arthur Pendleton left you his controlling shares in Pendleton Industries," Harrison continued, his voice filling every corner of that small office. "He left you the liquid assets, the offshore accounts, full ownership of Pendleton Manor in Connecticut. The estate is valued at approximately $85 million. You are the sole heir." My legs gave out. If Mrs. Higgins hadn't caught my arm, I would have hit the linoleum. Beatrice lunged at the desk, grabbed the pen and the $50,000 contract. Her icy composure, gone, obliterated. I whispered. My head was spinning. Richard spat. I stared at the contract. I looked at Mrs. Higgins, whose orphanage was drowning, whose roof leaked every storm, who couldn't afford winter coats for the new kids. Then I looked at the people who shared my blood. People who would have left me rotting here while they perched on millions. They had come to rob me, right to my face. Something new caught fire in my chest, something I had never felt before. "No," I said. My voice didn't waver. Beatrice went still. I turned to Harrison Sterling. 3 days later, I was no longer an orphan in Maine, heir to a billionaire's legacy, riding in a chauffeured Maybach toward wrought iron gates that looked like they guarded a fortress. Past those gates, hidden inside a private forest in Connecticut, stood Pendleton Manor. Not a house, a monument. Dark stone walls strangled by ivy, turrets rising like watchtowers against the sky. And me, sitting there in a simple black dress Mrs. Higgins had helped me find at a second-hand shop. A peasant who'd somehow slipped past the palace guards. Harrison Sterling sat across from me, shuffling through documents. He'd spent the drive peeling back the layers of what I'd actually inherited. Harrison told me. I whispered. Harrison said, his expression grim. "So I had to live in a mansion?" Harrison sighed, pressing his fingers against his temples. The heavy oak doors groaned open. My aunt and uncle stood waiting in the grand foyer beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. Next to Beatrice was a young woman about my age, blonde hair immaculately arranged, designer silk blouse, a smile that stopped well short of her eyes. Quote 46. Quote, she said, sweetness dripping like something manufactured. Quote 47. Quote, Beatrice's daughter. Hello, Chloe, I said carefully. Beatrice stepped closer. Her gaze could have frosted glass. Enjoy your stay, Lily, however brief it turns out to be. The manor is terribly old, walls are thin. It can be quite unsettling for someone unfamiliar with this kind of history. The threat barely bothered to hide itself. My room was the master suite, my grandfather's former quarters. It was enormous. The air carried traces of cedar and old paper. The bed alone dwarfed the entire room I'd once shared with 3 other girls at St. Jude's orphanage. But all that grandeur pressed down on me like a weight. The psychological warfare started that very first night, 2 in the morning. I woke, shaking, sat up in that massive canopied bed, my breath turning to vapor in the freezing air. The room was arctic. I checked the antique brass thermostat on the wall. Someone had cranked it down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I pulled a heavy blanket around my shoulders, reset the temperature, settled back into bed. Then I heard it. Click, clack, click. Clack. Footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate. Moving down the hallway just outside my door. I went rigid, held my breath. The footsteps stopped, right in front of my room. I stared at the brass doorknob. It began to turn, slowly. Click. The lock caught. I'd secured it before bed, but knowing someone was testing it sent ice through my veins. Who's there? My voice shook despite every effort to steady it. Nothing. Then, a woman humming, a lullaby, mournful and hollow, filtering through the heavy wooden door like something from another century. A minute passed. The footsteps withdrew, fading down that long, darkened corridor. Sleep never came back. Morning found me at breakfast, an elaborate spread in a dining room built for 40, seated at the head of the table. Beatrice, Richard and Chloe sat to my right, working through mimosas and poached eggs like nothing had happened. "Sleep well, Lily?" Chloe asked, spreading butter across a croissant. "You look exhausted. Those dark circles aren't doing you any favors." "Someone stood outside my door last night," I said. I set my fork down, looked Beatrice dead in the eye. "And someone adjusted my thermostat." Beatrice glanced at Richard, this slow, pitying exchange that made my skin crawl. "Oh dear, that thermostat in your wing has been temperamental for years. And the footsteps? The house is ancient, darling. It groans and shifts. Perhaps the stress of your new situation is getting the better of your nerves. It's perfectly understandable for someone with your background to feel a bit paranoid." "I'm not paranoid," I shot back. Richard laughed into his coffee, slurping it loud enough to fill the room. "Arthur used to hear things at night, too, right before the dementia consumed him completely. Tragic, really. It would be such a shame if you suffered from the same fragility, because if you're found mentally incompetent, well, the state won't allow you to oversee a multi-billion-dollar corporation. We'd have no choice but to pursue a conservatorship." There it was, the whole design laid bare beneath that thin veneer of concern. They weren't just trying to scare me out. They wanted to break my mind, or at least build a paper trail that said it was already broken. If I left, they won. If I stayed but crumbled, they'd petition the court and seize everything. A gilded cage, vipers on every side. After breakfast, I made my way to my grandfather's private study, the one room Harrison had cleared for my exclusive access. The door was heavy mahogany. It took a specific brass key to open. Inside felt like stepping into a different century. Bookshelves climbed floor to ceiling. A grand globe stood watch in the corner. And at the center, a sprawling mahogany desk with carved claw feet commanding the room like a throne. I sank into Arthur's leather chair, It swallowed me whole. I felt small, overwhelmed, completely out of my depth. My palms moved across the polished wood, searching for something I couldn't name, some trace of the man I'd never met. What was I supposed to do here? Was this your plan? To drag me into a house full of wolves and hope for the best? My fingers drifted along the ornate carvings beneath the desk's rim. Then, a subtle dip in the wood, a hidden latch. My pulse spiked. I pressed down hard. A soft click. A concealed drawer slid open from the side of the desk. Inside, a single sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was elegant but unsteady, trembling cursive that read, quote, 58. My hands shook as I tore it open. The letter inside was dated 3 weeks before his death. Quote, 59. The letter fell from my fingers. It burned against my skin like something alive. Air locked in my chest. This was not a fight over money, not a battle for an inheritance. I was living under the same roof as the people who murdered my mother, and I had 179 days left. I did not close my eyes that night. I stayed rooted to the center of that enormous, freezing bedroom, eyes locked on the bolted door. Arthur's letter gripped so tight my fingers had gone white. They murdered your mother. Those 4 words ricocheted through my skull until dawn finally bled through the velvet drapes. Survival. Nothing else mattered now. I wasn't waiting around to collect an inheritance. I was live bait in a dead man's trap. And the first rule of staying alive concerned the food. Arthur's letter had been explicit. Do not eat what they give you. Next morning, I walked into the kitchen, a massive, gleaming, commercial-grade operation, and found the family's private chef mid-prep. I have severe dietary restrictions, I announced, pulling a list I'd scribbled on hotel stationery from my pocket. Beatrice sat at the island nursing an espresso. She rolled her eyes. I said, holding her stare, bold move. It worked. For the next several weeks, I survived on pre-packaged protein bars, canned soup heated over a portable burner, and bottled water I bought myself from a local shop. The weight melted off me, cheekbones sharpening, clothes hanging loose, but my mind stayed razor clear. The psychological campaign escalated. Chloe made it her personal crusade to shatter me. I'd open my closet to find garments slashed to ribbons, dead birds from the estate grounds arranged on my bathroom vanity. Once, shards of broken glass pressed carefully into my expensive facial cream. I documented everything, every threat, every ruined possession. Photographs on my phone, uploaded immediately to a secure cloud server. But none of that was the real mission. The real mission was the East Wing. The East Wing of Pendleton Manor was supposedly closed for renovations. Heavy oak doors sealed it from the main house, secured by a modern electronic keypad. I spent weeks watching the staff, studying their movements, trying to catch the code. 42 days in, I finally got it. Richard stumbled home drunk from a late-night Scotch session and punched the keypad to reach the East Wing billiard room, where his antique hunting rifles lived. 1984, the year my mother was born. Even in his security codes, Arthur's grief over his lost daughter endured. I chose my moment carefully. Chloe's 23rd birthday. Beatrice threw a lavish party on the main floor. The manor swarmed with Connecticut's elite. Porsches and Bentleys choked the driveway, music thundering, champagne everywhere. For the first time in weeks, nobody was watching me. 11 o'clock that night, I slipped out of the ballroom, kicked off my heels, and padded barefoot up the rear servants' staircase. The oak doors of the East Wing loomed ahead. My palms were slick as I punched in 1984. The light turned green. A heavy thud as the lock released. The East Wing swallowed me in darkness. Dust and rotting wood thick in every breath. I used the flashlight on my phone, aiming the beam low along the floorboards. Couldn't risk light catching in any window. Down the long corridor, searching for the portrait Arthur had described. I found it in the grand library at the corridor's end. Massive. An oil painting of Cornelius Pendleton, Arthur's father, staring down at me with dead, unfeeling eyes. I set my phone on a nearby table, gripped the heavy, gilded frame with both hands, and pulled. It didn't move. Teeth clenched, I pressed harder until my fingers burned. Then came a grinding screech, the portrait swinging outward on hidden hinges. Behind it sat a steel wall safe with a digital keypad. Dread flooded my chest instantly. Arthur had never given me the combination. I thought back to his letter. __, quote, _, 66, __. I punched in my mother's birthday. Wrong. My own birthday. Wrong. The date Arthur died. Wrong. Think, I commanded myself, the muffled pulse of the party below thrumming through the floor. What single date embodied Arthur's deepest regret? The day everything shattered. The day my mother died. I keyed in my date of birth, the very same day she'd drawn her last breath in that hospital. The lock blinked green. The heavy steel door swung wide. Inside lay a single leather-bound ledger and a small encrypted USB drive. I opened to the first page. Dense, handwritten financial transactions covered the paper. Dates, account numbers, all linked to the Cayman National Bank. This was no ordinary corporate fraud. As I read the annotations scrawled in the margins, ice spread through my veins. Pendleton Industries operated a massive fleet of cargo ships. According to Arthur's notes, Beatrice and Richard had been using those vessels not just for smuggling goods. They were moving people. Human trafficking. Millions in dirty money funneled through an enormous international network, buried inside the company's legitimate financial statements. My mother had worked in the accounting division after finishing her education. She'd spotted the discrepancies. She'd confronted them. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a heavily redacted medical examiner's report. But Arthur had stuck a handwritten post-it to it. They had paid off the coroner. It wasn't complications from childbirth. Richard had slipped poison into her IV drip. Tears blurred everything. They hadn't just cut her off. They had tracked her down and killed her. And my grandfather, frozen by terror, desperate to protect the family name, had buried the truth for 22 years, until guilt devoured his mind. Then, without warning, floorboards groaned in the hallway outside the study. "Lily?" Chloe's voice, slurred and drunk, echoed down the corridor. "Where are you, you little wretch? Mother wants to cut the cake." I slammed the safe shut, straightened the portrait, and shoved the ledger and USB drive inside the front of my clothes. I killed the light and dropped behind an enormous leather sofa just as Chloe stumbled through the doorway, champagne flute wobbling in her grip. She squinted into the darkness. "Strange," she muttered, then turned and wandered back down the hall. I stayed frozen for 20 minutes before I allowed myself to breathe. I had the proof. Now I just had to survive the next 137 days. As day 180 crept closer, the air inside Pendleton Manor turned suffocating. What had been quiet scheming became open hostility. Beatrice and Richard weren't pretending anymore. Their window was shrinking fast. On day 160, someone tampered with Lily's car brakes. She barely avoided catastrophe. Still on the private estate road, she managed to swerve into a dense hedge. 12 days after that, she found her bedroom door had been unlocked from outside. A tarnished hunting knife rested on her pillow. The message was impossible to misread. Still, she refused to break. She stayed inside the manor, quietly reaching the outside world through a hidden prepaid phone. Long before things spiraled this far, she had already sent the critical evidence, the ledger and USB drive, to Harrison Sterling and FBI Special Agent Gregory Hayes. The trap was set. She just needed to hold on until midnight on day 180. The final night arrived under a violent thunderstorm. By 11:15 p.m., Lily sat behind her barricaded door, white-knuckled around a brass fireplace poker, counting seconds like they were prayers. At 11:20, the knob twisted. Richard's voice came through, calm, measured, terrifyingly controlled. She refused to open. The threats sharpened. Then the door buckled inward under sheer force. Richard charged through first, syringe in hand. Beatrice was right behind him, wild-eyed, barely holding herself together. Their plan was elegant in its cruelty. Stage a cardiac arrest brought on by stress. Make it look natural. But Lily didn't fold. She told them she knew everything, every crime, every cover-up, what they did to Sarah. That single moment of hesitation cost them everything. She swung the poker into Richard's side. He absorbed the blow, wrestled her down, pinned her flat against the floor. The syringe hovered inches from her neck. Then the world outside exploded. Red and blue lights slashed through the storm clouds. A helicopter roared low over the manor. FBI agents poured through every entrance. Richard went rigid. The syringe clattered to the ground. Agents dragged him up and locked the cuffs before he could speak. Beatrice was hauled out screaming, words that made no sense, sounds that barely qualified as language. Agent Hayes reached down, pulled Lily to her feet, and gave her the confirmation she'd been fighting for. The servers were seized. The crimes were exposed. The homicide investigation into Sarah's death reopened. When the clock struck midnight, Pendleton Manor passed into Lily's name, legally, irrevocably. 6 months later, she made a different kind of choice. She kept a modest share of the fortune. The rest went to orphanages and youth programs, places like the one that raised her. Pendleton Manor became a shelter for battered women, a house built on secrets, finally used for something true. Lily was no longer the girl defined by what had been taken from her. She had seized her own story back. She had dragged her mother's truth into the light. If Lily's journey from Street Jude's orphanage to outsmarting a dynasty kept you locked in, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who lives for a revelation that lands like a freight train. And subscribe. Every week, we bring stories like this. Now tell us in the comments, what would you have done with $85 million? We'll see you in the next one.